Resurrection is fundamentally different than resuscitation. It's not just a return to what was. It's not just beating hearts and expanded lungs. Resurrection is a transition into an intrinsically new way of being alive in the world. 10 years. Where to start? Well, how about a story about my son, right? When Common started 10 years ago, my son was 1 year old, and I have told lots of stories about him over the years, so to start there feels appropriate, classic even. Thing is, my son has recently now turned 11, and he is somewhat less enthusiastic about my stories these days. However, in the spirit of looking back, I've asked if I can tell an old one, reaching back into the archives, as it were. Because I was thinking this week about a game that we used to play around our house. See, my daughter, who is 4 now, is very fond of our doorbell. Demands to ring it every time we come home. She thinks that's great. But my son, when he was just a little older than she is now, also used to be fascinated by our doorbell. At the time, we had just gotten one of those newfangled fancy video doorbells. We've all got them now, but it seemed like a big deal 5 years ago. And I remember he basically thought this was science fiction. You mean you can tell me that you can stand at the door, ring the doorbell, and I can see you on the TV? Mind blown. So he would have a blast ringing it and answering it. He would ask me to go outside and ring the doorbell so he could see me on the TV. And if that doesn't sound like a lot of fun to you, you'd be right, but you'd also be surprised by what can entertain children sometimes. Anyway, every time we rang the doorbell, he would say, ding door, Daddy, somebody's at the ding door. And that was fun and kind of cute, but not really in line with social convention. And so not wanting him to later be ostracized for his doorbell ringing idiosyncrasies as he grew, I would say to him, buddy, it's not ding door, it's ding dong. To which he said back to me, Daddy, that doesn't make any sense. I'm at the door, not the dong. It should be ding door. And I have to admit, I still do. Maybe he has a point. Maybe social convention is the problem here after all. Thing is, I do think we get conditioned to certain responses that might not actually take full advantage of the moment. I mean, you could be saying ding door every time the doorbell rings, and you're not. Why? Well, I think it's because we tend to say the kinds of things we're supposed to say in the kinds of moments we're supposed to occupy. And I think because of that, sometimes we miss out on what's standing right in front of us. See, I think a moment like this, a 10th anniversary, a celebration of an extraordinary decade, the social convention is it's time to look backward. Time to celebrate everything that has been, to express gratitude for everything that was. And don't get me wrong, all of that is good. We should do all of it, of course. But I wonder if the best expression of an anniversary could be as much about a door to what's next as it really is a celebration of what was. And maybe that has more importance than just today. You know, Rachel and I, we're coming up on 24 years of marriage soon. I was thinking this week as I wrote this sermon, what if we reimagined our anniversary? Instead of going out for dinner and patting ourselves on the back for how we've made it another year, what if we spent an evening dreaming together about everything ahead of us in the coming year? It actually sounds like a good anniversary. We should do that, honey. Put it on the calendar. But grateful decades and wedding anniversaries aside, all of this strikes me as a uniquely Christian approach to ringing the bell. Because when the big moments happen, the biggest moments, in fact, I think what we find is that our faith is always orienting us forward. See, there's this moment right at the start of the book of Acts. And if you remember, in the Gospels, Jesus goes around teaching people about God, and that starts off well, but it ends rather poorly. He's executed by the state, deemed a threat to the status quo. Spoiler, he does come back. And the resurrection narrative is really the center of our faith. It's the divine stamp that tells us everything Jesus taught us is true. The way that he lived, the path that he walked, the choice of self-giving nonviolence, none of that can be defeated, at least not permanently. Now, the story can, like any good story, look bleak for a time, and hope can fade and light can appear lost, but in the end, Easter tells us love wins. That's the gospel. But then what? Well, then there's the book of Acts. And Acts does this really interesting thing. Because the story picks up with the resurrected Jesus sitting and eating with his friends, telling them that they will be empowered by the same Spirit that guided him back to life, explaining that they will take this new good news of conquering love to the ends of the earth. And then, in verse 9, legitimately one of my favorite moments anywhere in the Bible, this is what we read. After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. And they were standing, staring, looking intently at the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they asked, "why do you stand here staring at the sky?" Now, look, these stories are stylized, right? They're far more than just objective recountings of history. The writer is crafting a moment for us here. And this moment is just like really well done. Because it's funny, right? Jesus is crucified. He dies. Hope is lost. The sky turns dark. And for 3 days, the disciples cower in fear, afraid to leave the house lest they be identified with this deceased Messiah. But then, he's back. And the universe is changed. Death is overcome. Despair is washed over in the blinding light of resurrection. And now Jesus sits and eats and talks with his friends, spins yarns about wild adventures and missionary travels, and then he just floats off into the sky. And if you haven't given yourself permission to chuckle just a little bit yet, next 2 angels appear beside the disciples, and they're like, what are you guys looking at? Absolutely, one of my favorite moments anywhere in the New Testament. And it's partly for the surreal humor of it, but even more than that, I think it's because this moment just feels theologically significant to me. Like, this is important. This moment matters. And it matters because I think the normal instinct, the social convention here is to imagine the story is over. Jesus has come back. Death is defeated. Let's kick up our feet, sit back, and enjoy the show. And the narrative that the writer offers to us is, guys, things are just getting started. It's almost like the gospel writer says, okay, let's catch our breath. I'll give you a beat. Let's get some lunch. But you know what? The next chapter starts now. And for me, that kind of feels like what faith should be. That my foundation in what has been and what I choose to believe about what was, all of that consistently motivates me to believe in what could be next. Resurrection is fundamentally different than resuscitation. It's not just a return to what was. It's not just beating hearts and expanded lungs. Resurrection is a transition into an intrinsically new way of being alive in the world. And I think it's almost like God knows that our instinct is to consistently want to camp out in the big moments and stay there. Because as soon as the disciples ask, hey, Jesus, is now the time that you're going to restore everything that was to us? That's in verse 6. That's immediately when Jesus says, not even close, now's the time to look forward. I'm out. See, I'm convinced that sometimes our last best moment is what can make it hard for us to see our next great adventure. And I think that Jesus knows that sometimes all of us, we need a little bit of a push if we're going to keep on dreaming. Here's the thing, though. He doesn't leave them blind. He helps narrate what's possible. In the verse right before we read earlier, verse 8 in Acts 1, these are Jesus' last words before his grand exit. He says this, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all of Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And granted, this is one of those verses that sounds a little bit pious, right? Like power and spirit and witnessing and the ends of the earth and all of that. But there are some very practical implications here that are bound up in the prepositions and the punctuation. See, we have 4 geographies listed: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Thing is, there's only 3 prepositions here. Now, most English translations do a really good job of representing this with the punctuation. They have Jesus saying, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, comma, in Judea and Samaria, comma, and to the ends of the earth, period." And even though there's technically no punctuation in the Greek, that's perfect. That's exactly how this sentence is structured. Because each of these 3 geographies represents something for Jesus. First, there's Jerusalem. That's where the disciples are right now. That's where they've just experienced their darkest low and their most brilliant high. This is your 10th anniversary service today, or your wedding day, or that moment your story took a turn for the better. Whatever place it was where you began to believe that tomorrow could be something new for you. It's where it all starts. And you witness the divine, and you should celebrate that. But it's just the beginning. Because then there's Judea and Samaria. And this was interesting because these are slightly larger regions than the city. And in fact, Jerusalem was in Judea. So the scope is expanding a bit here. But the really intriguing bit is that Jesus shapes this next call with an ampersand: Judea and Samaria. And if you recall stories like the Good Samaritan or the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus encounters during his life, you might have some inkling that Judea and Samaria have a somewhat complicated history. The Samaritan culture was one born from the Assyrian conquest centuries earlier. And the Samaritans were the descendants of both Jewish and Assyrian ancestors. But to make things spicy, Samaria sat directly between the 2 most important Jewish regions of the time, Judea in the south and Galilee, where Jesus was from, in the north. That meant there's a lot of tension between Jewish and Samaritan populations. And here Jesus says that your resurrection story starts exactly where you are, wherever you have experienced the divine undeniably, but it rolls out immediately into all the conflicts that spill about around you. You don't go from the beauty of resurrection straight home to cozy Judea. You go to your neighbors and your neighborhoods, to all the people near you, to begin the work of removing the commas where ampersands are possible. I mean, think about this. It's one of the only things we have recorded from the resurrected Jesus. It's the last commission he gives to his friends, and it's this: guys, there is no more us versus them in the light of resurrection. There is only an and now. There's only your neighbor, only the work of reconciliation that you get to be part of. And that, I suppose, is almost like a whole nother kind of resurrection. Because it leads us to the grand finale, the one that I think permanently dismantles any decision for us to stop and pat ourselves on the back for a little too long. Because the story of new life that finds us exactly where we are, that breathes new breath into our lungs, that motivates us to repair the relationships around us, it continues on to the ends of the earth. It's a permanent and a perpetual reminder that there is always a next chapter, no matter how far we've come. And listen, that goes for your faith. There's always a new question for you to ask and deconstruct and rebuild into something more durable. It goes for your career. There's always something new for you to learn and apply and take pride in knowing that you have mastered. It goes for your relationships, your marriages. There's always room for you to do the work, to become more self-aware, more motivated by kindness and less driven by anxiety. But today, it definitely goes for us as a church as well. Because anniversaries are wonderful. and they're worth celebrating. But there are always new parishes to plant, new people to encounter, new stories to learn, new conversations to enter, new neighborhoods to fight for, new strangers to become, new friends that transform us into new people. And that is the work not of resuscitation, but of resurrection. Resurrection into new life and new breath. Resurrection into that divine purpose that is always calling us ahead to what God has next. So, Commons, why are you staring at the sky when the opportunity to love your neighbor well for another decade is standing right in front of all of us ringing the bell?
Hey, Jeremy here, and thank you for clicking through to watch that video. If you're intrigued by the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can, of course, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that we're posting here on YouTube. You can head to our website at commons.church, and you can find us on all of the socials at Commons Church. You can also join our Discord. There, the community is having all kinds of conversations about how we can encourage each other in the way of Jesus. Head to commons.church/Discord for the invite there. Also, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you and all the ways that you are journeying on this path toward Jesus. But thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the ways that you contribute to this conversation together. We'll see you soon.